Working memory is basically the way that you navigate any immediate environment, and it's very closely tied to attention because in order to know what to do now, and then what to do subsequently, and then subsequent to that, you need to be able to hold your attention to the things you need to do. In fact, working memory is involved in essentially every activity, both cognitive and motor, from the point you wake up in the morning until the time you go to sleep at night. What sorts of daily activities and life activities would require working memory? The answer to that is basically everything that you need to do, but that you don't want to remember. Now, what types of things would those be? Well, let's think about it. Most all of us learned at some point in our life to tie our own shoes. Presumably you know how to tie your own shoes. If you don't, perhaps you should learn. That's something that you know how to do, and you can do it as a procedural long-term memory. You can do that action, and you don't have to think about it too much. Working memory would come into play when, say, you wake up in the morning and you know that you need to head out for a jog, but you also need to make a cup of coffee first, and you need to remember where the coffee is, where your shoes are. Perhaps you're making a phone call or you're having a conversation while you need to tie your shoes, and so on and so forth. Working memory is basically the taking in of information that's critical for you to sequence your actions over a short period of time and then forget that sequence. For instance, I'm willing to bet that you put your shoes on to go running before you go running. That's sort of a duh. And if you're like me, you drink your water, your coffee, your yerba mate before you go running. The point here is that if you wake up in the morning and you like caffeine before you go for a run, there are a certain series of action steps that you need to carry out to hydrate, make that cup of coffee or tea, drink it, put on your shoes, head out the door. You need to sequence things properly, but you don't want to commit your long-term or even your short-term memory stores to carrying out that sequence. You simply want to be able to carry out that sequence and then discard that information about the sequence and focus your attention on, for instance, what trajectory you're going to run through the park or around your neighborhood. Then you want to discard that information and you want to lean into the next portion of your day, and so on and so on. Shortly later in this episode, I'm actually going to give you a working memory test. In fact, working memory is involved in essentially every activity, both cognitive and motor, from the point you wake up in the morning until the time you go to sleep at night, for every single day of your life. And we know this because there are indeed people who have diminished working memory or even lack working memory entirely. As you can imagine, they have a complete failure of ability to sequence activities, and their lives are extremely difficult. They need a ton of assistance from other people. So this is really highlighting just how important working memory is. Working memory is basically the way that you navigate any immediate environment. And as I mentioned earlier, it's very closely tied to attention because in order to know what to do now, and then what to do subsequently, and then subsequent to that, you need to be able to hold your attention to the things you need to do. So working memory and attention collaborate literally at a neural circuit level and at a neurochemical level in order to allow you to move through your day in an adaptive, functional way. Now, I can talk about working memory and the mechanisms, etc., all day long. But as is often the case, sometimes it's better to not just learn about concepts, but actually to experience them in real time. What we're going to do now is I'm actually going to give you a working memory test. This is the sort of working memory test that you would take if you were to go into a psychology laboratory or a neuroscience laboratory and they were studying working memory in humans. You're going to get data. You're going to get information about what your baseline working memory capacity is. And you're going to want to keep those data in your short-term memory stores, maybe even your long-term memory stores, but certainly your short-term memory stores, because shortly later in this episode, I'm going to talk about different ways to improve your working memory depending on where your baseline working memory starts, which, by the way, turns out to be a pretty good proxy for the levels of a neuromodulator called dopamine within the neural circuits that control working memory. So the first test of your working memory is very simple. I'm going to read off a series of letters, and your task is to remember as many of those letters as you can. The first string of letters is J, K, Z, P, I. Now, you in your own head can try and recite back those letters if you like. Okay, second string of letters, R, O, M, K, L, E. Now a third string of letters, this one's going to be a little bit longer, so cue up that working memory and attention. W, A, C, Q, V, D, N. How many of the letters I just read can you remember? Okay, so depending on how many letters you can remember, perhaps you have a low, moderate, or high degree of working memory. Keep in mind that some of you are perhaps doing other things, you're attending to driving or other tasks within your home or your office, and so perhaps you weren't able to pay full attention. So there'll be some variation there. But nonetheless, after reading each of those strings of letters, you were asked to recall those letters in your mind. And if you wrote them down and you're rereading them, yes, that's cheating. But how about this? What if I were to ask you now about the simplest first string of letters, the one that consisted of only 5 letters? How many of you can remember any of those 5 letters now? Okay, I can't hear you if you're shouting them out. I can't see you if you're raising your hand. But chances are most of you have forgotten the first series of letters, even though it was quite short and you could remember it early on. And assuming that you didn't write it down and you're not cheating, chances are you remember anywhere from 2 to 0 of those letters in that first word, which is a perfect example of your working memory. Nothing got committed to short-term, much less long-term memory. Rather, your working memory was able to work with that information, hold it in mind for just as long as you thought you needed to know that information. But then, thank goodness, that information was discarded. You didn't know that I was going to ask you for that first string of letters again after reading you the longer string of letters, but I did that deliberately to show you how your working memory works. So in some sense, the working memory task is a bit unusual in that it's a test of, yes, memory in the very, very short term, but also a test of your ability to forget, to discard information that's not critical. And that gets us back to the original definition of working memory, which is our ability to attend to specific small batches of information, remember it for just as long as we think we need to, and then to discard that information. And by the way, if you want to know what those first 5 letters were, they were J, K, Z, P, I. Okay, so let's say you have a short working memory span or a moderate working memory span, and you want to experiment with increasing levels of dopamine for sake of improving working memory. Now, let's start with the behavioral tools known to increase dopamine stores. That is, shown in peer-reviewed studies to increase dopamine stores within certain circuits of the brain that are relevant for working memory performance. And the protocol that immediately leaps to mind is the use of certain non-sleep deep rest protocols. Now, non-sleep deep rest, or NSDR, is actually a term that I coined because there is a practice called yoga nidra, which actually means yoga sleep, whereby individuals lie down, listen to a script, that is, listen to an audio script, which generally instructs you to do long exhale breathing, to deliberately relax your musculature of your face and of your body. It's a very interesting and unusual brain state. The difference between yoga nidra and non-sleep deep rest is that non-sleep deep rest doesn't include any of the intentions and removes a lot of the kind of opaque or sometimes called mystical language from the protocol. Now, a great thing is that yoga nidra scripts or protocols, as well as NSDR scripts or protocols, are available totally zero cost. You can find them certainly on apps like Waking Up, but also on YouTube. Why am I telling you all this? Well, in this study, they had individuals do effectively an NSDR protocol. They call it yoga nidra, and the protocol they used was essentially a yoga nidra script. And they evaluated the amount of dopamine available within the brain both prior to and after performing this yoga nidra script. And what they discovered was that after performing a yoga nidra protocol, the baseline levels of dopamine, that is, the amount of dopamine available in the basal ganglia and a few other structures of the human brain, of course these are humans, was increased by as much as 60% in the context of cognitive performance and a few other circumstances, all of which point to the fact that cognitive performance, and in particular tasks that have a working memory element to them, so they weren't the exact working memory tasks that you did earlier, all of those show significant improvements in task performance. So while something like NSDR or yoga nidra might sound kind of mystical or kind of weak sauce to some of you, it is really powerful stuff. And it's powerful stuff as it relates to the very neurochemicals and neural circuits that are involved in working memory. So if I were to take a step back and just say, okay, what are some zero cost, very low, if any risk protocols that one could perform in order to improve dopamine levels without having to ingest anything, take anything, really do much of anything at all, except lie there, do this progressive muscle relaxation, and improve or increase the levels of dopamine availability in the brain significantly? Well, then NSDR and yoga nidra really are the first line tools if one wants to do that.